Good evening. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes Manchester and Leeds YouTube channel. Today we have the second session of our series Hispanglia, a series in which we aim to get to know the political, economic, and social relations between Spain and the United Kingdom throughout history. On this occasion, we have the honor to have two eminent British Hispanists, Robert Goodwin and Alexander Sampson, who will talk about a wide range of issues, a mutual interview that will touch on politics, art, literature, theater, and British attitudes to Spain across the ages. This evening, as I said, will be a conversation with our guests on a wide variety of topics. Throughout their talk, they will explain what made them fall in love with Spain and the Spanish people, in order to bring in Dr. Samson's fascinating recent research into the question of what did it mean to be a Spaniard or español in the Habsburg period. They will also reflect Dr. Samson's recent research into the relations between England and Spain during the early modern period, with the book Mary and Philip, the marriage of Tudor England and Habsburg in Spain, and his long-standing love for Golden Age theatre. They will also endeavor to set those subjects within the border story of Castile and her empire, as told in the books of Robert Goodwin, Spain, the Center of the World, 1519-1682, and America, the Epic of Story, Spanish North America, 1492-1898. I will now introduce our guests. Dr. Robert Goodwin, he has a PhD from the University of London, is a honorary research fellow at the University of London, and regularly contributes on papers for scholarly journals and conferences. His main published books are Crossing the Continent, the Story of First African American, 1527-1539, Spain, the Center of the World, and America, the Epic Story of Spanish North America, 1493-1898. He has written opinions and range of historical and political topics for the Spanish newspaper ABC. Dr. Alexander Sampson is a reader in early modern studies at the University College London. His research interests include the early colonial history of the Americas, Anglo-Spanish intercultural interactions, and early modern English and Spanish drama. He had edited volumes on the Spanish Match, Prince Charles' Journeys to Madrid, 1623, with Jonathan Tracker, a companion to Lope de Vega, and Locus Amoenus, Gardens and Horticulture in the Renaissance, a monographic special issue of the Renaissance study, as well as having published articles on the marriage of Philip II and Mary Tudor, historiography and royal chronicles on the 16th century Spain, English travel writers, firearms, maps, John Fletcher and Cervantes, and female Golden Age dramatists. His book, Mary and Philip, The Marriage of Tudor England and Habsburg in Spain, was published by Manchester University Press, and he also runs the Golden Age and Renaissance Research Seminar. He's director of the UCL Center for Early Modern Exchange and Center for Editing Lives and Letters. Thank you very much, Dr. Goodwin and Dr. Sampson, for accepting our invitation. For us, it's a great pleasure to have you today. And without any further ado, I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you very much to the audience. And after the talk, we will have like 15 minutes where you can put your question in our chat, and we will put it to our guests. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Pedro. It's a great pleasure to be here. Muchas gracias a ti.
Muchas gracias, Pedro. Un placer estar aquí. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Al Sampson and I have known each other a very long time, I think it's safe to say these days. But I realized as we were preparing for this talk that I don't know how you first got interested in Spain, Spanish history and all things Spanish. what was your flechathel? How were you first introduced to this country we all love so much?
Well, it's a great question, and I think that there are two answers. There's a slightly kind of more self-promoting answer, and then there's a slightly more flippant answer. So the more self-promoting answer is that when I was at university, I did my undergraduate dissertation on the wonderful play by Tirso de Molina, The Trickster of Seville, El Burlador de Sevilla, and I had one of those wonderful Arison Phillips bilingual editions. And essentially, that's how I started learning Spanish from that. And then the slightly more flippant reason is
Tan largo me lo fías.
The slightly more flippant reason is that I was very much in love with. I had this wonderful girlfriend who knew somebody who was setting up a language academy in Madrid, and so she was moving out to Madrid after I left university, and I duly followed my heart to Madrid, but sadly she dumped me more or less as soon as I arrived. So I ended up wandering around the bohemian kind of late night city in Madrid and fell in love with that instead, and kind of replaced, the kind of wonderful food and people and kind of incredible nightlife that you had in kind of Madrid in the early 90s. So that was kind of how I got into it. And then, once I got into the libraries and archives, it was just such a pleasure. I just remember, the people would look at me slightly suspiciously, but then they would bring me these massive, huge piles of incredible documents and just kind of throw them on the desk in front of me. And it was just that magic of reading a letter that Philip II wrote, almost half a millennia ago, and just hearing those voices. And kind of learning the wonderful formal language that you find in these documents. So that was kind of how I first got into Spain and its history. How about you, Bob? What was it that kind of drew you to Spain, and particularly to Seville, which is where you are now, clearly?
Well, actually, curiously enough, the first place, and I still have the passport with a stamp of entry in it from Barcelona Airport in 1987. Otherwise, it's a remarkably similar story, except that I went to Barcelona chasing a girl who basically took no interest in me once I got there, so I didn't even get dumped. But likewise, I then ended up spending a summer in Spain at the age of 18, and I saw, it was a wonderful country. Everybody seemed to be smiling. Everybody seemed to be laughing. It just looked like a wonderful place to live. And I thought, well, I'd better learn Spanish. And it took me a bit of time to get going, but that's more or less where I started. So, yes. And I'm afraid, I don't really have a promotional version of that story. It took me a long time to get round to doing anything serious, like applying to the British Academy for a grant to go and research, do some research, which eventually turned into my first trade book, my first commercial book, Crossing the Continent, in the Archivo de Indias, which had the great advantage that it didn't open in the afternoon. So after a long morning's work, it was time for lunch, and that sort of fed into my PhD thesis, which was on the representation of food in art and literature in the Spanish Golden Age in Spain in the early modern period. But anyway, moving on from these personal introductions, al grano, as they say, let's get to the point. What does it mean to be Spanish, to be a Spaniard in the Habsburg period? The period we're talking about from the early 16th century to the end of the 17th century, and it's a big question, and it's a varied question, because you've got the Aragonese, you've got Catalans, you've got Basques, you've got Navarrese from Navarre, people from the Balearic Islands, Canary Islanders. You've got people living in the Americas. So there are peninsulares, the Spaniards who went to the Americas, but increasingly there was then, a population of Spaniards born in places like Mexico and Peru and the Caribbean. And then, of course, you've got the Indios, you've got the indigenous people in the Americas, plus you've got Black Africans who were transported there, and so that's quite a wide range of people who, in one way or another, could be described as subjects of the Spanish crown. Not to mention, of course, the Dutch from the Spanish Netherlands during that period, or Italian. It's what today we think of as Italians. Now people from Naples or from. So there's it's an enormous range, and
I think
we've also got this question of how other people saw Spaniards. So it's not just how are Spaniards thinking of themselves and defining themselves or not defining themselves, but also how other people thought of Spaniards from, and the obvious thing, in particularly in Protestant parts of the Netherlands, often in England and in Britain, and
well, I think that is really a fantastic question, and it's not a simple question. And I think there are a number of different ways of thinking about this. So the first thing is to point out to the fact that the dynasty that rule over Spain are effectively a foreign dynasty. And interestingly, in Spanish historiography, they're often called Los Austrias as opposed to Los Habsburgos, which I think is kind of interesting. So I think that kind of deterritorialized authority, and I think if we also think about some of the terms that are used in history books to discuss and think about this period. So it's often talked about, the Hispanic monarchy, the crowns of the Spains, and Spain itself as a term, Charles V was called King of the Spains, plural, early on in his reign, and it's really across the reign of Charles V that we begin to get perhaps emerging some sense of Spain. And I think, as in addition to that sense of internal diversity, so you have the Cortes in Aragon, the Cortes in Castile, swearing obeisance to their new kind of their monarch who had been brought up in the Low Countries, of course, and didn't even speak Spanish. One of the kind of early conditions that they imposed on him was that he learned to speak the language. So I think that sense of a kind of lingual, multi-ethnic, and kind of multi-religious society. And I think what I would say as well is that there's an interesting contrast between the way that Spain is thought about and talked about today, as opposed to the way that it was seen and viewed and experienced by people living at the time. So I think today we tend to think of Spain in very homogenized terms, but those are very much kind of ex post facto rationalizations of the complexity of territories. So we think about the different crowns, the different kingdoms which made up, and of course John Eliot famously used the phrase polycentric monarchy, that it's a polycentric monarchy. It's a monarchy that has a number of different centers. And I think actually calling it polycentric doesn't do it justice in some ways. It's not just that it's polycentric, it's that the different kind of centers play different roles in constructing and building what we think of as Spain today. So in relation to the New World, for example, you talked about the Indios, you also talked about Negros as well. And it's interesting that a lot of Black Castilian subjects, and there's been some very interesting research on this recently, they basically think of themselves as being old Christians. And one of the reasons that they kind of cite in these freedom suits, or indeed in trying to transfer inheritances from the New World back to the peninsula, they talk about the fact that they are old Christians, that they've always been Catholic. And of course, you know, that brings us on to the issue of religion. And a few years back, there was a wonderful conference about where the eminent Hispanist, Professor Trevor Dadson, gave a keynote, a lecture. And you know, Trevor sadly died recently, a great loss to the discipline. But Trevor asked the question in his keynote: is it possible to be Muslim and Spanish in the middle of the 16th century? And essentially his answer to that question was yes, that there were still people who were identified as Spanish, thought of themselves as being Spanish, despite the fact that they were Muslim, even well into that period where we tend to think of Spain as a much more homogenous, both religious and kind of cultural space. And, you know, perhaps to kind of, you know, finish in a sense, just exploring that theme, you know, from an initial point of view, as you say, there are, of course, subjects in the Netherlands, in Italy, and not least, not to mention England, because, of course, Philip II was King of Spain when he married Mary I. And he came to Spain in 1554 with a huge entourage of courtiers.
Came to England. Yeah.
There's a wonderful quote from the Earl of Westmoreland, who famously said that while his master and his mistress continue to be together, he is going to attempt to be a Spaniard to the uttermost of his ability. So I think it really underlines the fact that in some ways there's a big difference between your allegiance to a monarch as a subject, you know, who you identify or what you identify as in that sense, and what your community is, where you feel rooted. And of course, communities in this period were much, much smaller. You know, vecinos and comunidades, you know, to be a vecino of a community meant to have spent 10 years living in a particular place. So I think there are both these very rooted, localized ideas about identity, and then there are these very broad, kind of big ideas about identity. And I think that Spain really, as a concept, as a kind of territory, across this period is kind of coalescing and coming into being. And I think in some ways the technologies of cartography, the effective spreading of royal authority to all corners of a particular geographical space. So you look at the Americas. I mean, you know, the Spanish effectively controlled bits of territory there, but there were large parts of the Americas which were effectively administratively empty spaces. You know, that they may have been on a map labeled as Spanish, but in effect, no Spaniard had ever been there. And, you know, to talk about them being controlled by Spain would be a vast exaggeration.
Well,
so
that
I think
was probably still true.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, well, I was just going to say, I mean, that was probably still true, yeah, towards the end of the 18th century, even at the beginning of the 19th century, when all these spaces, the maps changed the apparent jurisdiction over all these spaces. Yeah, I mean, you think there were never Spanish Louisiana stretched from New Orleans to Canada, and most points in between, and there wouldn't, with the, however you try and count them, there were never more than 5,000 at the absolute maximum number, 5,000 European people of European descent, living in that space. Well, that's I mean, that sort of says it all. And that was that was at the time of the American Revolutionary War. So
yeah. And I think it's that, the huge kind of, one of the things that always, really strikes me is the cosmopolitanism of Spain, and just thinking about Seville in the 16th century, almost, I think it's about almost 10% were black. It's a much, much higher proportion than it is today. It was a much, in a sense, it was a city.
Well, there's much more reason to be there. I mean, today it's a beautiful place, but some, unless you work in tourism or for the Junta de Andalucía, there's only so much to do there. Whereas it was the New York of its or but yeah, I suppose the New York. It was the global capital of its day, wasn't it? It was the third biggest city in Europe. It was had an enormous transient population, and also it had a monopoly over all the exports to the Americas, which meant that it was also a good place to sell slaves, and therefore it had a large black population because there was a constant supply of slaves being sent to America through Seville. Which is not to say that there weren't many freed black men and women in Seville and in the Americas at the time. Quite a lot of slaves were manumitted in one way or another.
And Español is the one of the kind of major themes, isn't he, of your first book, Crossing the Continent?
Yeah, although he was never formally freed. He freed himself. It's a long story, but after serving the Spanish crown in the most extraordinary way possible by essentially making possible the first ever crossing of North America, first ever documented crossing of North America, the first ever crossing of North America by people from the old world, starting in Florida and ending up, sort of somewhere on the Sonora, Arizona, California border area. He got back to Mexico City, and instead of being freed, they tried to they definitely didn't free him, because they wanted to set the guy, his owner plus the viceroy, wanted to send him back north to see what he could see and conquer some lands. And of course, if they'd freed him, much of what he conquered would have then become his. So they sent him as their agent, but in fact what they also did was put him in charge of a military expedition, which they were not supposed to be doing at the time. And the interesting thing is that the first major European expedition into what is now New Mexico was led by a man almost certainly, but he was possibly born in Azamor, in a Portuguese possession now on the Moroccan coast, but almost certainly he was from sub-Saharan Africa, and he led the military detachments of that expedition, and the people he was leading were almost certainly Tlaxcalans, who were the population, who were the indigenous polity who helped Cortez conquer Mexico City, Mexico Tenochtitlan, from the Aztecs. So basically the European exploration of New Mexico, Arizona was conducted by an African and a lot of indigenous Mexicans, people from and I think certain irony to it.
I think that's what I was going to say, is that I think that those kinds of facts, really underline to what extent, historical traditions are very much construction. So if you think about, coming back to the theme of Hispanglia and how both, Britain perceives Spain and how Spain perceives Britain, there are two things that I would just quickly point to. The first thing to say is that very few British people, despite the fact that Tudors are nothing short of a kind of national obsession, very few people know that Philip II was King of England. And it comes as a surprise, even to relatively well-educated people who know something about the period. Really, was he? And you think, well, yes, he was. Yes, he was, and he was here. And I think from the other side, one of the things that my book tries to do is it tries to look at the reasons why it's the case that Philip's period as co-monarch and King of England is so little studied, so little regarded, and seems to be almost, out of step with what we think of as, Tudor history, which runs from Henry VIII and the Reformation, stopping very briefly on Edward and Mary, and then really focusing again on Elizabeth. And that's kind of, that's very much the, the nature of the constructed tradition. On the other hand, I was really amazed when I came to Spain many years ago to speak at the conference in Almagro on Teatro Clásico, to be introduced as somebody who was studying Mary I, that esa reina tan sabia y tan santa, dijo Felipe Peraza Jiménez when he was introducing me. And I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of, my work is done here already. She's already recognized. And, not a lot of people are aware of this fact, but there's actually a tube station named after Mary Tudor in Madrid. There is no such public monument to her in Britain. And people forget, of course, we talk a lot about the Virgin Queen, but people forget we already had a queen. The first regnant queen of England was Mary I. If you kind of ignore Matilda way back in the kind of the early medieval period, where, and it's complicated, but she was certainly, a very formidable queen whose reputation is, I think, seriously undermined by the fact that I think both the Spanish and English historiographical traditions really kind of, almost a kind of turning point, a kind of watershed between a splitting off between them, happens around this period in the 16th century. And of course, the Anglo-Spanish War that goes on, from the, kind of Cold War at first, but heating up in the 1580s, and is eventually brought to an end through the Treaty of London. I mean, just, again, very briefly, it would be worth touching on the fact that one of my first jobs at the University of St. Andrews was tracing translations from Spanish, and the cultural influence of Spain in early modern England has been completely ignored in the literary histories. Nobody really talk, people talk about France and Italy because those are the languages that people traditionally studied in this country. But as the Spanish language has grown, people have become increasingly aware of the massive influence of Spanish culture in early modern England. And
the 18th century, the 18th century English and American literary, literary figures were well aware of the debt they owed to.
Yes.
Charlotte Lennox's the female Quixote. You couldn't have had Defoe without.
Absolutely. The English novel.
Quixote.
Yeah. Exactly.
And everybody, when John Jay was sent by the Continental Congress to try and get Carlos III, Charles III, to join the Revolutionary War on the side of France and the rebels. There's a fascinating correspondence between his wife, Sarah Livingston Jay, and members of her family, and they all write to her, sort of saying, "Tell us about the land of Quixote. Is it really filled with damsels? Are the men as gallant as they?" This was a major topic.
Well,
it was a major sort of cliche of 18th century English language literature.
And I think you wrote about this in your book, your wonderful book, Spain, which I was rereading, by the way. I have a copy of it here, a lovely book.
Thanks for the... Available in all good bookshops and direct from the publisher.
Exactly. You mentioned Sir Richard Wynne and him kind of arriving in Santander. Richard Wynne was a servant of Charles I. So when Charles I and Buckingham disguise themselves as John and Tom Smith and turn up, unexpectedly in Madrid.
You should tell the story. Not everybody is going to know that story. You should tell.
Well, yes. So after the end of the Anglo-Spanish War, James I, the Rex Pacificus, wanted to kind of ensure peace in Europe, and one of the things he thought he was going to do to solve that was to marry his son and heir Charles I to the Spanish Infanta. So Charles, and the negotiations dragged on a bit. So Charles decided to kind of precipitate matters and go to Madrid. He turned up completely unexpectedly in Madrid in 1623.
Traveling incognito. They traveled in disguise. I
mean, I love the fact they wear fake beards and kind of moustaches. You're thinking, what was the point? Who would people really recognize him from whatever portraits they?
Well, probably just having a laugh. I mean, frankly, they were having a. But it's extraordinary. And then they turn up in Madrid, and it was the Duke of Buckingham who was the the ambassador at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, no, Duke Buckingham was James.
Buckingham went with him.
Yeah, and it's the Earl of Bristol.
It's the Earl of Bristol. Yes, sorry, I've got them the wrong way around.
The ambassador. No, but you mentioned Richard Wynne, who is one of the gentlemen of Charles's bedchamber. He turns up in northern Spain, and he wants to get to Madrid to serve his master, and they won't let him leave. They won't give him the travel license, and so he goes around looking for Dulcinea del Toboso. On the north coast of Spain, and people tell him, it's that village over that way. So already his understanding and sense of Spain is being filtered through Don Quixote. And of course, the first translation of La Torrilla de Tormes was effectively framed as a travel guide. It says, if you want to know about the kind of the nature of sundry Spaniards, then read this book. As if kind of La Torrilla is
kind of travel warning.
Yeah, it's the sort of Berlitz guide to Spain.
But anyway, okay. So the last sort of anecdote. Is it true that when Philip was King of England in the middle of the century, so this is in
54 to 58,
1550s, mid 1550s.
Yeah.
Is it true? So just before he became King of Spain.
Yes.
And is it true that he launched a project to bolster our maritime defences, and particularly sort of the sink ports and or is that a bit of a myth?
No, I mean, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, Philip II was very, very interested in military strategy, and he was one of the people who, when he arrived in England, began to have serious conversations about building up the navy. And it's actually as a result of those conversations and those kinds of new policies, that basically England had the navy that it did have in 1588 when they defeated the Spanish Armada that he sent against them. So he was kind of responsible in that way for his own downfall. And I think in some ways the fact that we harp on 1588 and it's such a kind of central part of England and Britain's kind of national mythology. We forget that England sent an armada to Spain in 1589, and then Spain sent another two armadas in 1596 and 1597. So that there were a lot of armadas, and in fact, the Spanish Armada lost relatively few ships, and the English Armada, which went the following year, was a complete naval disaster. I think they lost 40 ships, as compared to 6 that were sunk as a result of the Spanish Armada. So
I am moving house at the moment.
This great military victory was really nothing of the kind.
I am moving house at the moment, and the man who runs another commercial break, Manuel Moves, it's called. The man who runs Jamie Manuel, who runs Manuel Moves, is a direct descendant of a Spaniard wrecked off the coast of Scotland.
Wow.
And one of the armadas, I'm not sure if it was the 1588 one. There is nothing Spanish about him whatsoever, other than his surname, which he has preserved. But
it's remarkable.
But that sort of draws attention also to the fact that it's the story of the Armada is another one of our great national myths, isn't it? Which sort of Sir Francis Drake was playing bowls, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about it because of the but actually it was just that he couldn't have sailed anyway because of the tides, and there's a whole sort of there's all this mythology around it, and supposedly we sent the fire, the English ships sent the fire ships in, and that's what defeated the Armada, but actually it was just a huge storm that blew them off course." and
exactly.
And there was almost no naval engagement, was there? I mean, there was very little fighting apart from a small.
I think the Spanish Armada could very easily have been successful at almost any point, and I think it was again a sort of, it was a failure that was brought about by a kind of lack of kind of deference to authority. And the problem is when you're at sea in charge of a massive fleet of ships, who's in charge? And waiting for Philip to send you instructions. And I think coming back to the empire, this is really one of the big things that defeats the greatest enemy of empire is distance. The fact that any kind of communication can take months to arrive where it needs to arrive. But there were countless missed opportunities on the part of the Spanish Armada, and it's really because Medina Sidonia was not a good choice. As a kind of military leader. It was a disastrous decision, and very much kind of in deference in a way to his prestige and aristocratic name rather than his experience as a soldier. That I think is a really kind of fascinating story. But I wanted to ask you, Bob, some more about Spanish America, and move away a little bit from England, if we may, in the last couple of minutes, and just ask you about Spanish America. I mean, you sort of alluded to the fact that the kind of Spanish DNA in the story of the United States is something that's often in some ways overlooked. But what about Spanish America and figures like the Inca Garcilaso? That kind of racial mixing that went on in the new world, and what was the Inca Garcilaso? How Spanish was he? What's the relationship in a sense between his Incan kind of aristocratic heritage and his aristocratic Spanish heritage?
So just to explain who we're talking about.
Yes, good idea.
The Inca, the person known as Garcilaso de la Vega el Inca, who is best known for writing a major account of Inca Peru and then Spanish Peru in the late 16th century, was born to one of the conquistadors who had conquered Peru with Pizarro, and he was a fairly senior figure in Spanish Cusco, but he wasn't one of the leading figures, and he took as a mistress an Inca princess known as a Palla, so she was the mother of Garcilaso de la Vega, hence El Inca. Although until he was about 18 or 19, he was known as Gomez Suarez de Figueroa. But his father then refused to marry the Inca princess and instead married a Spanish woman, supposedly, according to El Inca Garcilaso, of extremely dubious background. So it's interesting that this man born in Spain who had conquered Peru still preferred to marry a Spanish woman rather than an Inca princess.
Yeah.
Not surprisingly, this irritated his son. And when the father died and the son inherited a chunk of change, the son decided to go to Spain to get educated at the university in Salamanca, which he proceeded to do. And he was taken under the wing of an uncle who lived in a sort of small medium-sized town called Montilla, which has a very nice fino type wine in Cordova. And the uncle was pretty well off and was childless, and he left everything to Garcilaso, who never married himself, but we're almost 100% sure on the basis of some archival research that he had some children, and he appears to have left them some money, and he appears to have had a very long-lasting relationship with a Spanish woman who nonetheless he refused to marry, which is an interesting act. Who's repeatedly described as a servant in various documents. Yes. Now, he dedicated his life the rest of his life to looking after his estates and writing books. And one of which is this famous account of Peru in two parts. The Inca history of Peru, and then the history of Peru after the Spanish conquest. But what's interesting is that he presents the Incas as though they were the Romans. So his points of reference are all classical. And he also wrote another book about the misadventures of Hernando de Soto, who had been Pizarro's right-hand man during the conquest of Peru, returned to Spain very wealthy, and was granted the right to the conquest of La Florida, which at the time was basically all of North America that he could lay his hands on. And he set off on this expedition with a large number of people and thousands of pigs. So, I mean, I guess they were eating quite well, because Spanish, we all know those little pata negra Spanish pigs taste good, but it all went horribly wrong. And this expedition is quite well documented on. But again, El Inca Garcilaso doesn't tell the story of what really happened. He tells it as it should have been.
Right.
And there's a remarkable scene in the center, right at the heart of this story. So, in the context of Renaissance literature, this is where you would expect to find the most important bit of the story. And there's this scene where Hernando de Soto meets a phenomenally wealthy local female potentate. Now, no one thinks that there was any culture as wealthy as the culture described anywhere in the Americas other than Peru and Mexico. So he's essentially writing about the Incas, but he's put them in Florida, and this extremely wealthy, there's this extraordinary scene where De Soto meets this princess, this American princess, and she seduces him by unwinding an enormous string of pearls. And he describes this, it's almost erotic the way he describes it. And De Soto's response is to take an enormous ring with a huge ruby set in it off his finger. And I can't remember if he actually puts it on her finger, or he certainly gives it to her. And the symbolism of this is fairly obvious. Here is a man wishing that this is what his parents had done.
Yes, yeah. Put a ring on it, as they say, right? I mean, I think one of the things that's fascinating about the story is the way that what is effectively a historical narrative, you have these novelistic elements, these elements which are clearly fictional.
Well, even more bizarrely, for years, historians used this stuff as though it was
a history.
It was history. And people would have the big art. There were academic debates about where this woman's empire must have been, and it's like, well, in the imagination of a man sitting in a small village in Cordoba where they have excellent wine is the answer to that question.
Listen, Bob, I think we're perhaps coming to the end of our time, and we should probably open it up to questions. So just all I would kind of maybe say by way of conclusion to some of this is that that situation that you're talking about, Bob, of Spaniards going to the New World and kind of marrying Inca princesses or kind of indigenous princesses is very much paralleled, I think, in some of the work I did this last term on Spanish Golden Age drama, just thinking about the role of race in that. And so I did a play by Tirso de Molina, another play by Tirso, called La celosa de sí misma, jealous of herself. And that's all about a guy who's from Leon, who falls in love with a woman who's come back to Madrid with her father, and the father is a perulero. And he falls in love with her just by looking at her hand in church, because she's kind of veiled. And he's only interested in her when she's veiled. As soon as he can actually see her, he's not interested. And so she kind of starts playing off with this kind of use of disguise. But the point I wanted to make was simply it shows that you have these people who've gone out to the Americas and then the desire for them to come back to the metropolis. And the play is all about racial anxiety, an anxiety about the racial mixing that comes with the kind of cosmopolitanism that was implicit in a global empire. So maybe is that a good note to finish on, Pedro? Do you want to?
We have time, but the audience, you are welcome to put your questions in the chat. If you might want to ask in Spanish, it is possible also, because...
Por supuesto, alguien ha preguntado por qué no estamos hablando en español.
Yes.
Es porque no todos aquí
the people who don't speak yet Spanish, but you are welcome to put the question to Robert and Alexander, if you have any questions. But let me, you mentioned, Alexander, in your talk about the influence of the Spanish culture in Britain in the Philip II era. Could you give some examples for us?
Well, yeah, a classic example of this would be, so people, obviously you've heard of the King's Men, which was the company that Shakespeare was the principal dramatist for, but his successor was a man called John Fletcher, and a quarter of all of the plays that John Fletcher put on the London stage between 1616 and his death in 1625 were based on prose fiction by Cervantes. So either on the exemplary novels, the Novelas Ejemplares, or on El Quijote, or kind of incidents from El Quijote or from the Persiles. So in a sense, a quarter of the dramatic output of one of the most famous and most important dramatists of that era derives directly from Spanish culture. You can look at the influence of Garcilaso de la Vega, for example, on Sir Philip Sidney and the Arcadia. Jorge de Montemayor's Diana, for example, is translated by Barnaby Googe and published. It's in manuscript first, it's published much later on. But again, that's something else that influences the Sidney family and the kind of circles around them. I'm in the process of doing some work on Robert Ashley, who was a lawyer at the Middle Temple, and he bequeathed his huge, for the time, massive library, 3,000 books to the Middle Temple. And of those 3,000 books, there are maybe 400 Spanish volumes, which are copiously annotated. And they not only have his annotations, but they have annotations by John Donne, by Ben Jonson, John Donne famously in his portrait writes, has that tag "antes muerto que mudado," which is a quotation, I think, from Montemayor's Diana. I think that's right. But so there's a huge influence, and there's great interest in learning Spanish. You have the first Spanish dictionaries. John Minchau's dictionaries are really famous, and they have a subscription list, so you can see all the famous aristocrats and politicians and so on who bought copies of the earliest Spanish English dictionaries.
Then why this influence had been overshadowed, because later on the influence of the French culture was very important, but this Spanish influence is not in the public mind. How you would any explanation for that?
Yeah, absolutely. The explanation. So there's a wonderful book by a scholar called Barbara Fuchs, who works at UCLA, and the term that she uses is disavowed emulation. So it's that thing, rather like many of us feel about American culture. We might poo-poo it, but there's no denying that American culture is massively successful on a global scale. And I think Spain's power in this period led other nations to look on Spain with envy and admiration, but that envy and admiration towards a political threat is problematic. So you might take stuff from the culture, but you'll make it your own and pretend it didn't come from Spain. So that's what she means by that term of disavowed emulation. So you copy stuff from Spain because it's the best stuff. There's the famous quotation in the Ben Jonson play, I think it's Bartholomew's Fair, where the Spanish beard is the best cut, the Spanish jennet is the best horse, and as for Spanish steel, let your poor captain speak. So clearly these comic characters are very well aware of Spain's preeminence in fashion, in all sorts of areas. And one of the areas, and one of the things that's hilarious, is that Spain had a reputation for terrible food. Can you believe it in this period? That people laughed at the fact that you couldn't get hold of any meat in Spain, and they ate chickpeas and garlic and things like that, and salads and olive oil, and people thought that was just appalling.
Black pudding legend, as we called it.
The black pudding legend.
Exactly. Olive oil was just not such a long time ago. They had an image not so positive in the country, I think. Mm-hmm. There is also this, greasy food that the people that might know it very well, they just, too much olive oil in the food, it's Spanish food.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, changes in what we know about nutrition and diet, and the Mediterranean diet being so good for health, have really transformed the way people see perhaps different cuisines around Europe, for sure.
Yeah, in the last 30 years or 20 years, but before it was like that. Robert, you have written a book, this Estebanillo, who traveled the whole America and from Miami, from Florida to the east, to the west coast, and how you came about to study this figure? Because again, it's not very well known even in Spain. We are not aware that there's such a figure.
Well, the story is best known from, and it's really quite it's really quite well known in the sense that there are a number of Spanish editions of the original text describing the story, and there are a handful of English translations, including in a Penguin edition of the account of this extraordinary adventure, written by one of the Spaniards involved, who was called Álvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. And who's from a pretty well established gentry family in the south of Spain. He was related to the Ponce de Leon family. He was pretty well connected, and he had gone in the first really major expedition sent to try and conquer La Florida, which, as I say, at the time effectively meant the whole of North America, but nobody knew what North, there wasn't a map of North America at the time, so nobody realized quite what a big landmass was there. So a friend of mine had suggested I might be interested in reading Álvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's account of the 10 years that he spent getting from basically from somewhere near Tampa Bay to the Sonora, Arizona border. The routes debated in places, but and they did the first bit in some makeshift boats, and then it was a sort of it was a story of incremental disaster. More and more Spaniards died, until finally there were only 4 people left. Álvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who'd been the treasurer of the expedition, well, technically was still the treasurer of the expedition, a relatively young Castilian called Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, and a ferry who was from somewhere near Salamanca, and another man who was from sort of the gentry from around Salamanca, called Andrés Dorantes. And Andrés Dorantes had a slave, but much more in the sense of a personal servant, who we know as Esteban. He was baptized at some point, we're not quite sure when. And these 4 managed to cross Texas, get up into what's now northern Mexico, and eventually, after a very long time, they came across some Spanish conquistadors riding north up the west coast of Mexico, up the coast of the Gulf of California. And so when Álvaro Núñez got back to Spain, he published an account of what had happened. In some of my research, I think I've demonstrated that he then left that. Before it was published, he left it with his editors. And then Andrés Dorantes made it to Spain after Álvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca had left Spain. And he appears to have had a hand in producing the final text. But so this is a story which is, it's kind of relatively well known, certainly in academic circles. People are familiar with it.
For the general public.
But of course it's, in a way, for the general public, it's just another story about some Spaniards who got lost in America, and there are lots of stories like that.
Yes.
But what seemed to me very interesting at the time I was reading it, the first time I read it, was that although this African character is rarely mentioned, we know he's always there. So when Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes were writing their account of what happened, they weren't writing it because they wanted to. They were writing it because they wanted to get something out of it for themselves. But once you start reading it with a view to what actually must have happened, how on earth did these people negotiate their relationship with a series of Native American peoples, you start to realize that there are just little comments here and there which made me realize that Esteban, the African guy, was right at the heart of everything important that happened. And it makes a certain amount of sense. You've got 3 noble Spaniards, and a guy was probably born in sub-Saharan Africa, is likely to have been traded by either Muslim slave traders taking him across the Sahara, or Portuguese slave traders who then took him to Azemmour, where he probably grew up, or finished growing up, there was then a huge famine in that part of the world, and that's probably why he ended up in Spain. He's adapting to different cultures, and learning how to survive within those cultures was second nature to him. That's what he'd been brought up with. So
yeah, effective in this sense. We have a question from Amanda. She says, "Hi, thank you so much for an informative session. I am currently a PhD musicology student, and I still find historiography meant to justify either one side or the other, like an eternal polemic that barely analyzes cultural works. How does current British scholars approach Spanish history and culture? Do both countries still have a need to justify certain mentalities? For instance, in my thesis, I am constantly asked to explain the history over and over again. And then obviously there is little space left to the actual interesting things. Thank you."
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I could just jump in there, I think that's a great question, Amanda. Thank you very much for that question. I think one of the things, I think British scholarship is fascinated by Spanish history, particularly in the period that we've been discussing today, between the 16th and 18th centuries, because Spain ruled over a global empire. Because you have everything from the Philippines, to Acapulco, Mexico. You have ivory from Africa being carved in Manila and then displayed in churches in Mexico. It's the beginnings of globalization. It's the kind of, and I think that's its fascination. And I think in the last decade or so, scholars have become increasingly interested in, I would say, its diversity, the issues around diversity. So it's about precisely those kinds of questions that we've been thinking about tonight, about the transnational nature of these things, where you have, people born in sub-Saharan Africa and being traded perhaps by Portuguese slave traders into other places, and then eventually ending up in the Americas and being recorded in, what has become a classic kind of tale, the naufragios of Cabeza de Vaca, but yet they've disappeared from that narrative. So I think that Spain's history is of great fascination. And in fact, there's a previous question about from CPL asking about how interested British historiography has been in the history of Spain, large number of books and journals published annually, and why Spain is not taking the same interest in historical events in the UK. I'm not sure it's possible to answer both of those questions, but one thing I would say is that, British history and the British Empire was posited ideologically from the very beginning as a kind of an antithesis of Spain's empire. So I think we've had this kind of constant kind of, again, mythologization, if you will, of Spain as an imperial power, as kind of tyrannous and cruel, and that actually British imperialism was so much better. And I think, we really are coming to understand how that contrast is very much an effect of attempts to justify British colonialism and British imperialism in the 18th and 19th centuries, rather than actually saying very much about the history of Spain and the global empire, that it ruled over in this period. So I think that's the fascination. And what I would say, the final remark I would make is that I think that UK PLC does an incredible job of selling our own history. I think we're more successful perhaps than any nation in Earth in creating, Downton Abbey and, this kind of, nonsense in a way, this kind of twee sort of cliche, stereotypical kind of idea of Englishness. We're very good at that. And I think that Spain has not been as effective in a way in doing that. But I think recently there are signs that there's more and more historical fiction. I think Isabel, the television española series, was fantastic. I think the, Carlos Rey Emperador was not quite as strong. I think it was not as good as that first one. I really like La Peste from Antena 3, which was a 4-part kind of detective fiction set in Seville in the 16th century, a character waiting for the treasure fleet to arrive with an outbreak of plague. I think that was a series that began to reposition the kind of thinking about Spain and its past, and was very good. I thought it was really, really interesting what it was doing. You know, I was very impressed by that. So yeah, that's what I would say. I think, you know, that sense of the historiographical traditions are almost in competition with each other between England and Spain often. And I think that's maybe one of the problems.
Thank you. I don't think there are any more questions. Have you got any comments, Robert, maybe, or Alexander, that you might make? We are coming
well,
to...
no, just to thank everybody for listening and putting up with us for 45 minutes. It's very kind of you to take time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to us chatting, and it's been great fun. Thank you very much, Pedro, for inviting us, and a big thank you to the Instituto Cervantes. It's been a lovely occasion.
Super. Yes, thank you very much indeed. We've much enjoyed it.
Thank you to you. It was a huge honor and pleasure. It was very informative, and I will finish in Spanish because alguien dijo que por qué no hablamos español. Entonces voy a aprovechar para también daros las gracias en español. Ha sido una charla tremendamente entretenida, muy informativa. Muchísimas gracias y enhorabuena por el excelente trabajo que realizáis. Así que esperamos poder contar con vosotros para otras ocasiones en el futuro. Thank you very, very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Hasta pronto.
Hasta luego. Adiós.
Hasta luego.